What's up? It is Cody from the Keepers of Nerdom. How y'all doing? It's time for part 2 of our Great Britain series of Is It Accurate for Axis and Allies Miniatures. And so we're going to start looking at the bigger point-valued vehicles that I own and that are from the earlier sets of the game. Unfortunately, one of the things that isn't a part of the earlier sets, which was really unfortunate, and I'm shocked that they didn't do, was the Matilda. And I've been looking at one on eBay, just tempted to get one soon because it's a beautiful, beautiful vehicle. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see one and preview that as well. But today we're going to look at these vehicles right here, and we're going to start off right off the bat with one of the weirdest, craziest things. And I feel like I actually pulled this really early on because it's just an uncommon. But it was, for a vehicle, one of the most fascinating things. And I was so disappointed when I pulled it. And it's actually the Archer Tank Destroyer. Because the reason I was so disappointed was you just kind of hope for something better. But actually, for an uncommon slot, this was actually one of the best things you could pull. And the Archer Tank Destroyer is one of the most fascinating, weird, silly things. Because if you'll notice back here on the back, it is actually the chassis of, if I can find it again, the Valentine tank. And you'll notice right off the bat, these are actually not to scale. And so that's one thing to note right off the bat, that this thing's a little bit bigger when it really should be almost the exact same scale, if not the same scale. But it really is built on the chassis of the Valentine tank. But they decided they needed something interim to put in as the vehicle to destroy some of this crazy stuff that was coming out of Germany. And the Archer self-propelled tank destroyer gun was armed with a 76.2 millimeter anti-tank weapon, and it is crazy strong. The unfortunate thing is it only has up to 60 millimeters of armor, so it's actually less than the Valentine, I do believe. 65 millimeters was the max of the Valentine. So the Valentine had more armor, but as you'll notice, the Archer didn't come out until 1943, so it's a much later thing. So really the armor is just not sufficient. It's, again, here's an interesting thing. It goes down to that 4 armor, or the 3 armor right here on this tank of a 3.3 with a speed of 2. Very, very slow. And if we look back just a ways to the Valentine tank, it has an interesting issue. The Valentine had a defense of 5.5 and a speed of 3. And so the funny thing is the max speed of this gun was 14.90 miles per hour, which is the exact same speed, at least according to the tank information I have, as the Valentine. So this really shouldn't actually have only a speed of 2. It should have the same speed, but it actually does technically have it because of Strike and Fade 1. And so that's actually where it comes in. But the defense really doesn't make sense considering some of the just simplicity of it's still built on a Valentine. I would say the interesting thing is because of how it's built, that the frontal armor would actually have been the front where we're talking about the 5, but it's also a 5.5 all the way around for the Valentine. So again, doesn't quite make sense. It really doesn't. So something is not accurate here, but it also does make a lot of sense for the point value. It's 21 points where the Valentine 2 is 16 points in the game. It's very, very poor anti-infantry. If you get below a 6, you're not only poor, you're extremely poor, because most infantry have a 4 defense, so you would have to have the odds in your favor quite heavily. Anti-tank, though, is where things get crazy. And with a 76 millimeter, this makes sense, and you'll see this with the Sherman Firefly. It has the exact same attack stat as a Sherman Firefly. That's 76 millimeter, same size, 15, 13, 11. Fixed rear gun, this unit can attack vehicles only if they are behind this unit, so you always have to face this thing into the rear. It does have an extended range, which accuracy-wise, what do you do with that? I don't know. It is an anti-tank vehicle, and it's designed to be spotting and firing from a concealed position. So to an extent, I get it. Where things get a little crazy is this. Gameplay-wise, this is fantastic. Really, though, this seems a little bit ridiculous because Strike and Fade 1, in your assault phase, this unit can move at speed 1 after attacking. So if you go first, you can shoot and then move 1 space. And in like the game in city hexes, you can actually move away from them and they cannot see you and shoot you. Now, if they have the ability to get to you, because I can't remember if it's, it's move, and then assault. So a move for them, a move for you kind of thing, and then an assault for them, an assault for you, like shooting phase essentially. And that's a big deal. This just makes things strong. Now, if you go second, it's completely useless. And that's where that speed 2 is going in. It's actually right here, as the third speed is right there. But gameplay-wise, that makes for a pretty strong thing, because you could literally fire, even at long range, an 11 power shot and then go strike and fade away from them. So accuracy-wise, I would say this is lacking some accuracy. The armor doesn't make sense. The strike and fade. Even in my tank book, it does talk about the idea of it would often fire and then move away, but it's just so slow. It really should have its 3 speed at most already with the Valentine. If anything, they should just both have 2 speed, and I would be okay with that. So, or even if this thing had 1 speed, that would be interesting, because that would make it so much more dependent on being on a road and getting into the spot it needs to. So that's the first one I want to talk about. The next thing is something a little bit bizarre. It is the Cromwell, and it's right here, the Cromwell 4. Cromwell, I really appreciate, and it's a fascinating vehicle, because I remember kind of pulling it, and I've pulled it twice, which is just a lot of fun, because it's 22 points. It's 1 point more than the Centaur, or sorry, the Archer. Looking at several of my vehicles in my tank book as well. The interesting thing here is it has a defense of 5.4 with 4 speed. The 4 speed makes a lot of sense. It's 31.67 miles per hour. Totally makes sense. It's fast, especially for a tank of the day. And this is from 1944, so a little bit later in the war. This is more like a medium tank than anything, but the armor goes up to 2.99 inches, which is reflected in the 5.4, which is really interesting that the Valentine... All right, let's just talk about this for a second. So Valentine, I'm just going to have to set this down for a second because we need to talk about this. Valentine is fascinating because Valentine has up to 2.56 inches, and in the game is represented by a 5.5. Cromwell 4 has up to 2.99 inches and and so Valentine has a 5.5 and this has a 5.4. And that's crazy. Like, this has almost 3 inches of armor in places. Now, granted, that's not going to be everywhere. And so apparently we're talking about a lot of frontal armor, which that makes sense. That's totally the case. And that's all right. That's fine. Not a big deal, but it's very frustrating because sometimes you go, why? Now, granted, if there's not a lot of armor on the back, which probably is the case with how fast this thing is, that makes sense. But just bizarre to me. Now, what you're paying for really is the attack stats against infantry, which still not great, but 7.76 is at least decent to be able to do something. And then 14.11.9, great against vehicles. Vanguard is where things get interesting. A lot of vehicles in Great Britain stuff have this, or at least enough that I go that it's kind of their defining trait in the game. After both armies are deployed, this unit can move at speed 4 before the first turn begins. Kind of feels like something in the Africa Corps. So this is really interesting because you can get into position before the game even begins and be closer to the enemy, closer to your objectives, because you're always trying to hold an objective in that game, and I believe it's at the end of turn 7. And that's a lot of fun, but it also makes for an interesting challenge because once the infantry get in, then things get really tough. So this makes it for just interesting because you can get into position quicker than other things. Overall, is this accurate? I would actually say yes, except for the frontal defense. It just, part of me almost says maybe the Valentine should have a 4.4 when this should have the 5.4 because of that frontal armor being a little tougher. I don't know. It's a tough thing, and I just don't ever have a good answer on some of these things, but yet I want to go, I feel like something's off on the defenses here a little bit. So not necessarily on this, but maybe especially what we're seeing with the Valentine and the Archer tank as well. It just doesn't make sense for their defenses entirely. But what do I know? I didn't live in World War II and experience it. I just play a board game that has them. Now, this is something very interesting, and it was a really fun pull and I've pulled it a few times. It's bizarre. It's crazy. What this is a Churchill, but it's a Churchill AVRE. And so it's actually equipped with a mortar gun, and it was used for potentially mine clearing and obstacle crossing. This is a very different version of the Churchill. So you just need to understand that this isn't going to be fully reflected in any book that I have. What I have is Churchills, and then actually the Churchill Crocodile, because they wanted to make sure that the Churchill had everything. Although I wish we just had a standard Churchill. I'm almost tempted, if it had a decent gun on it that looked half normal, to just take off all the junk on the edges of this thing and just repaint it. Because it's cool with the thing up here, but yet you just can't enjoy the actual vehicle itself, because this is an early model of Churchill because the exposed tracks are there. But the funny thing is, a Churchill has very, very high defenses. And you're going to see that because a Churchill, even in the earlier versions of it, get really high armor. The very earliest editions of the Churchill have up to 102 millimeters or 4.02 inches. So they represent this by speed of 2, 7-6 defense. So in the front, this thing has 7 defense. Now, one thing I think that the game never really does a good job of illustrating is getting hit in the tracks. Disruption is the closest thing, that when you get hit but not truly damaged, you're disrupted. So it could be a track broken, or you're just surprised and you can't move during disruption once it's face up. So it kind of makes sense. But what's funny is this is supposed to be a Churchill from 1944. And so it's kind of interesting. So this may very well be a Churchill AVRE that's actually, yep, the Churchill AVRE is actually the later mark, so it's up to 152 millimeters, the 6 inches of armor. So it is a later edition, but what's funny is it doesn't have the track guards for it as well. And so this does have a bigger just defense, which makes sense. I wish we had an earlier Churchill. I'm gonna go searching for, maybe the game had some earlier edition stuff, because I would, the original expansion stuff, the original like first 5-6 sets didn't have anything other than the Churchill Crocodile and the Churchill AVRE. And I'm glad for them, but as you'll see here, up close against infantry, it is a just absolute wrecker. And against vehicles, it's pretty terrible because it doesn't have anything else here except for that 10 right there. So you have to be really careful with this. AVRE, this unit ignores obstacles. The unit destroys each obstacle it crosses, and it destroys each obstacle in hexes it enters. So it just keeps rolling and destroying things. And obstacles are things like just tank obstacles, pillboxes, things like that. It just crushes them, which is kind of fun. This makes for an interesting gameplay scenario. Blast, when this unit attacks, make a separate attack roll against each unit in the target hex. This includes friendly units. So this actual 12 attack is twice. So if there's 2 infantry in the hex, they're both going to get hit. So when it hits, it is exploding. And this unit's attacks ignore covers. Ignore cover, sorry. And so this thing is just, it's a specialty version of a Churchill, 25 points to field. If you want something that's going to have a 7.6, I don't know that I've ever fielded this in the game because you just don't know what to do with it, because long range, it doesn't do anything. You just kind of are a sitting duck, but unfortunately for your opponent, you're a sitting duck with a 7 defense up front, that's going to be really, really hard to ever penetrate with standard arms. Like, it's very possible, when you get into the big guns like King Tigers and even Tiger 1s, but that's going to be a tough one to crack, especially from smaller things. So overall, is this accurate? I would say, yeah. I mean, the only thing that isn't really represented is this whole log thing on the top of it. That, like, was this meant to deploy as a bridge, or is this meant to protect it from artillery fire? I'm not 100% sure on that. And unfortunately, if you look down in here into the superstructure, you can see it's not really, it's painted, but there's nothing else in there. There's no logs shown. Kind of a funny thing. But it's a beautiful sculpt. And the one thing you'll notice is that the Churchills, especially that front plate, is that the Glacis plate, completely flat. And that's basically true on Churchills in general, but they have such thick armor that it just doesn't matter. And so before we come to the actual Churchill, we need to go to one of my personal favorites of Great Britain, and this is one of those things that just I love. I'm a fan of the Sherman in general, but the Sherman Firefly, you'll notice when you look at it, it's just turrets kind of, you can fix it over time if you had something to set it and to fix that turret, but it is the most beautiful, crazy, silly tank system in the world because the Sherman Firefly is a Sherman that is armed with is it 17-pounder gun, I believe? Yep, 17-pounder anti-tank gun. So they weren't necessarily as accurate as regular Shermans, but they were definitely better equipped to handle some of the anti-tank or the anti-tank roll. And what's funny is they're armed with a 76 millimeter 17-pounder gun, whereas the regular Shermans for a long time were armed with a 75 millimeter. And that one extra millimeter doesn't sound like a lot, but apparently whatever they were doing in Great Britain was packing an interesting punch. So let's do a special thing here. This is actually the U.S. Sherman. We'll come back to it when we do the U.S., but I think this is an interesting thing. 21 points, 997, better against infantry, 13, 11, 9. And then you'll notice the Sherman Firefly does not do very well against infantry. There are no special abilities on either one of these cards, nothing. And I love that actually, because what's special about them is their stats. Their stats. The armor on, say, a Sherman, for example, is not going to be big, right? It's not meant to be. But what's interesting about the Sherman is, if I can find it, early Shermans, because that's an early production Sherman, has up to 2 inches. Again, 5.4. Even if we go to the later production model, which this is a 1942 Sherman, this should be an earlier one, so it should have only the 2 inches. The later ones have 2.5 inches. And so if we go back to the Valentine, it has 2.56, and so it has 5.5. But up front, the Sherman is saying, I'm represented as a 5. I feel like that probably should be a 4. Maybe, not necessarily for the Firefly, but an early production version of it. And you'll even see, like, this is definitely from the front look. It looks like a more early production type of Sherman because they were more rounded instead of just straight up. It's interesting. I'll just show you real quick. Here's the example. So this is a late production Sherman, very flat and, sloped on the front. And the early production Shermans have that curvature on the bottom with the rivets. And that's what I'm talking about. That this definitely has the riveted and the ridges right there of the rivet. And so it's just kind of an interesting note that really I think early Shermans should have probably a 4.3 or a 4.4 for defense. They have the same speed. Totally fine with that because a Sherman could go at a speed of 23.6 kilometers per hour. Later on ones could do 29.19 miles per hour, and the other one could do 23.60 miles per hour. So overall, I think that's fine, but they represent the 76 millimeter gun versus the 75 by not just 1 extra die, which I think would have been fine, but 2. So I think in some ways this is accurate, but I think it's a little strong. 14, 12, 10 would be fine, and it would make it definitely outshine this, and you could drop a few points off of this to like 26, and it would still be something that you go, yeah, I want to take that. It's not going to be an anti-infantry like the US M4A1 Sherman, but it would definitely still pack a serious punch. But as it is, gameplay-wise, you field this and your opponent will know when it hits them because it packs the same gun, ironically, as the let me get it out. The Sherman. Huh. That's hilarious. This is why I love games like this, because you get to look through your stuff and you go, oh, but I could do that, and it's fun. So they have the exact same stat of gun because they're both packing a 76 millimeter gun, and so they're being accurate within their own game, which I totally like that. That's great. That's a good idea. So I think it's a little strong. That's all. Even just a +1 to the die rolls would be pretty cool. So we come now to one of my favorite looking vehicles, and this is in many ways, even though it's represented in a different way, this is the classic Churchill. But it's actually not just a Churchill according to the game. It is, in fact, see if it's written down here. I think so. It is a Churchill Crocodile. And Churchill Crocodile, what that means is it is actually a flamethrower tank as well. And so that's represented against its anti-infantry stat right there. And so the Churchill AVRE is 25 points. This thing is 35. Still a speed of 2. Defense is 7, 6, same. Definitely doesn't have as high of an attack up close for infantry, but it has a much better attack stat up here overall. Again, these things have up to 6 inches in the front, which makes sense with the 7.6 armor. Totally get it. Totally agree. The miles per hour, 12.42, very slow. Let's check that against the Archer, though, real quick. What was the Archer's? 14.90. See, that's interesting that they get a 2-speed, but the strike and fade. Kind of interesting. And Valentine has a 14.9 as well. Kind of interesting stuff. I don't know what to do with that. So the main gun on this is a 75 millimeter, which they're being very consistent with the 13-11-9. Excuse me. So that works. So later production, Churchill's had the 75 millimeter gun. Now the abilities that it has: flamethrower. This unit's short range attack ignores cover. If this unit rolls 3 or more 6s on a short range attack, the target is destroyed immediately. So it's simulating that if you hit hard with a flamethrower, it doesn't matter how many other hits you get, you're burning them. It's gone. And what's interesting is this is 3 6s on an infantry or a tank, like a vehicle. Okay, that's interesting. That could be very deadly because 13 attack is not great, but what if you roll those 3 6s? All of a sudden that 13 kills a King Tiger instantly, regardless of how many successes you hit. Pretty cool. Superior Armor 2. An attack must beat this unit's defense by 2 or more in order to score 2 hits against it. That's fascinating stuff. Those are the interesting things of the game. Because in the game, if you get hit multiple times in a turn, they just have to keep equaling your defense as far as I've ever seen. But if someone hits you first off with their big gun, they have to hit your defense and then go 1 above it to score 2 hits. And if they want to destroy you in 1 shot, they have to double your defense, which is kind of funny whenever you have like a 1-1 defense something. All you have to do is roll 2 successful hits and boom, they're gone. Pretty cool. Overall, I would say the Churchill Crocodile is accurate. It is fantastic. This next one, I'm not really sure what to do with because these are vehicles that came in very late in the war. They say 1945 on here, and I would say probably weren't really in the war, and we'll see. It says they were here, and the Comet is in here, so we can talk about the Comet. The Centurion. Yep, the Centurion wasn't actually in World War II, but it was built during World War II and right at the end of the war. So the Comet right here. So this one actually was in 1945, and it does say down here, and it was interesting, late in the war, the 11th Armored Division was the first to receive this new tank. Comet drivers tested the tank's speedy performance on German highways. This is just an uncommon, which is really cool. I love when they give you just simple, awesome tanks. The Comet, let's grab him real quick. Let's look him over. He's kind of a simple paint job, and you can tell that with the uncommons that they don't really care as much. They're going to put more detail into the rares, and I get that. You know, we're going to put more time, energy, and detail. And there's that flat Glacius plate again. See, this is why I don't like playing Great Britain stuff, because you just start to realize as you play them and then you study their stuff, their military doctrine was very strange. They really wanted to have tanks that were super slow to stay with infantry, and then they wanted, with heavy armor, but then their turrets were too small to carry anything. And then they would like do really fast tanks that had no armor, and they still weren't fast enough to get away from things to the point where they could actually dodge stuff, and they'd just get destroyed. It just doesn't make sense. So this thing, it says, has up to 4.02 inches in the front. So it's represented with a 6, and I say that in the front, we're not exactly sure, but down to all the way less than an inch other places. The Churchill, let's look real quick, because that's quite a, that's just not good, you know what I'm saying? Less than an inch on some of the spots on the Churchill as well, the Crocodile. And so it's kind of interesting, like, something about this tank, they're saying it had spots on it that was worthy of only a 3, where we've got the Churchill Crocodile as a 7.6. I don't know. I think that's a little too harsh. Maybe a 6.4, and I think that would be fine. This thing, though, could go 29.19 miles per hour, whereas a Churchill could go 12.42. So double the speed. Totally get it. Totally works. We're good. Against the Cromwell, let's just see out of curiosity. The Cromwell could go 31.67. They have the same speed, but it also has the Vanguard. Pretty cool. So this has a very good anti-infantry. It does have a 77 millimeter main gun, also referenced by a 1513 11, but the actual caliber was 76.2 millimeters. Kind of interesting there. So it's actually very similar to a 76, so they just represent it as a 76. High gear 1, if this unit makes its entire move along a road, it gets +1 speed. So something that they're saying is it does really well on roads. Again, I just think that makes it a little too fast. Battlefield awareness, the unit can make defensive fire attacks against vehicles that move out of hexes adjacent to this unit. That's really cool, but I don't know how you'd really accurately, I don't know, maybe it has some good spotting on that. That's interesting. Just seems strange. Yeah, anyway. Superior Armor 2. An attack must beat this unit's defense by 2 or more in order to score 2 hits against it. I like that, and I think it's decently accurate, at least with the frontal plate armor that they're saying here. But I will say, 6.4 maybe? 6.4? Something like that. 40 points, though, to field this thing. And it's a good tank. It's just if you can get behind it, you're going to destroy it pretty easily with just about anything. So, not the most accurate, but I think it's all right. The last one here, and we don't really have much information in the book, this is the Centurion. Some of the tanks that were in some of the games that I think were a lot of fun. There's its information. These are fun to have. They're interesting, and you don't often see them. I've seen occasionally people field a King Tiger, and I appreciate it. But really, they'll note just down here, the first Centurions were rushed off the production line in early 1945. They arrived in Germany too late to see combat. So they didn't actually see anything in World War II, but they were built during World War II with World War II technology. And so they're in the game, but are they accurately represented? There's going to be a really hard thing because they're saying, sorry, the camera's freaking out here. Well, let's look here. First off, design-wise, it doesn't actually have a flat front plate, which is good. And so they're saying it has a 3-speed, 7.4 defense. So again, sides and back, not necessarily very good. On infantry, not great, not bad. 16, 14, 11. So they're probably saying it's got something more than a 76 millimeter gun, probably in the 77, 78 millimeter range, something like that. If so, cool, totally get it. I like it. It's fine. Robust, this unit gets +1 on movement rolls while disrupted. This unit has speed 1. I love that because then it can move while disrupted still, but only 1 speed. That's cool. Superior Armor 2. An attack must beat this unit's defense by 2 or more in order to score 2 hits against it. Cool. Extended range, this unit's long range against vehicles 5 to 12 hexes. Armor-piercing rounds. You'll see stuff like this, especially on the bigger vehicles. Once per game, before you roll this unit's attack against a vehicle, you can declare you are using these rounds. If you score 2 hits against that vehicle with this attack, score an additional hit. So you can, once per game, declare you're using this, and if you hit and at least get 2 hits through, insta-kill it. A vehicle. That's really, really cool. You just hope and pray they're not in cover and can roll out of that with a save. And then all of a sudden, everything you've just done is pointless. What do we say about this? Is it accurate? I'd say for the gun concept, yes. Speed sounds like it apparently wasn't very fast, which is really interesting that you've got Sherman Fireflies and Cromwells, which I'm totally fine with this. The defense looks fine to me, especially for a heavy tank like this. It's just the interesting question of what do we know about it? Well, we know about it from other things past the war. But in World War II, how did it fare? Well, the answer is don't know because it didn't happen. And so you enjoy having tanks like this in there. And the reason they're in here is because Germany has things like the Tiger One and the King Tiger that otherwise there's just nothing else that the US or Russia or Great Britain actually truly has, except for like the Pershing for the US. And Russia, what does Russia have? Well, and it's like, that's what's funny. The IS-1 they never put a model out, and the IS-2 technically was part of World War II, so you have that, and IS-3s I don't think were actually a part of World War II, if memory serves. So they put some of these in just to illustrate that you could fight against those big crazy things if you want to have those kind of battles. But what I found is actually the best thing to do, especially in military stuff like this, is buy yourself a bunch of things like this, the Archer, and just hammer away at them with these little vehicles, a lot of them, because for 50 points you could field 2 Archers and 8 points of something else, right? And so that matters. And maybe sometime we'll go into some of the infantry stuff, because those have impact in the game as well. Because these vehicles, that's also what I'm basing it on, is, you know, these vehicles look really cool until you realize they have serious issues against certain things in the infantry divisions. So which vehicle was your favorite, and which one would you like to hear more about on the channel? Let me know in the comments below. I've been Cody from Keeper's Nerdom. Take care. Bye.